Hey, it's week 15 fantasy football, and you're looking for some wide receivers that spend more time with the balls in their hands than a Kardashian on a day of the week that ends in Y. There's a lot on the line this week. It's fantasy playoff time, talking wide receivers. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there. Welcome to week 15 here, fantasy football, where we're talking about them ball catchers. That's right, wide receivers here for week 15. Who are we starting? Who are we sitting? It's a very critical week. We're looking for some of the safest plays this week. We don't want to take too many gambles and really shoot ourselves in the foot and hurt our chances of advancing to the championship round. So that's what we're looking at today. Now, just a reminder, don't get too caught up with what column these guys are in. Just listen to the information and let that be what really makes your decision for you on Sunday. Trying to make those decisions a little bit easier. But before we get into all of the matchups for week 15, let's see how we did at the wide receiver position in week 14. Overall, a really solid week for the wide receiver position there in week 14, and we had a total of 66 wide receivers that we gave a start or sit designation to that finished their games this past week. Out of those 66 players, 43 were correct for an accuracy percentage of 65%. Some of our biggest hits, Emmanuel Sanders. He absolutely went crazy, had him listed as a start last week. Hope you listened because he more than likely helped you win your fantasy matchup. Robert Woods continues to rack in receptions. Allen Robinson. John Brown we had listed as a sit. A lot of people didn't like it. He did not perform. Robbie Anderson had him as a high-risk, high-reward play. He paid off. He was a hit also. Some of our biggest misses. A.J. Brown. I actually talked about him in last week's video saying it would not surprise me and saying that he was capable of going off. And he did. But it was a huge risk, and we weren't willing to take it last week. Do we do it this week? We'll find out here in a minute. Darius Slayton. He was the favorite target for one half of a football game for Eli Manning. You have Marcus Johnson there of the Indianapolis Colts. Some of you probably don't even know who the heck he is. Had himself a big day. Then you have Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He had himself a nice last week. And Jarvis Landry. He disappointed in week 14. Going to kind of somewhat give him a little bit of a pass. The guy has been a super solid wide receiver too, majority of the season. But now we're heading into week 15. Super critical that we make the right calls here this week. So let's take a dive into all of the matchups and find out who we can trust here this week. Thursday Night Football, Jets and Ravens up first. And is it time for Marquise Hollywood Brown to come back and help us here in the fantasy playoffs? I know he has absolutely sucked for 2 straight weeks, but difficult matchups going up against San Francisco and the Buffalo Bills. It's actually somewhat impressive what he's done the last 2 games. I don't think I've ever seen a stat line like this. In the last 2 games combined, he only has 4 receptions, but he has -1 yards. How do you even do that? I mean, that's got to be some type of impressiveness, but let's, kind of look past that a little bit. Now, he gets a matchup against the New York Jets, who give up over 24 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and it only gets better because their secondary is crazy banged up right now. You have Jamal Adams, Arthur Maulet, and Brian Poole, all in that defensive secondary that are dealing with injuries and may miss the game this weekend. We know that Mark Andrews, even though he's back at practice fully, he had a little bit of an injury scare this past week. Do they kind of rest him, scale him back a little bit to keep him healthy and fresh for the playoffs? That's entirely possible. I'm looking for more Hollywood Brown this week for some increased volume in a great matchup. Give me Hollywood this week here for the Ravens. Now, for the Jets side of things, Jamison Crowder has apparently gone into hiding because the guy was super solid middle of the season and has totally disappeared. He has 7 receptions for 56 yards and no touchdowns over his last 3 games combined. Demaryius Thomas, he's only had 3 games all year where he's had at least 50 yards receiving, and he's only had 1 touchdown on the year, which he got last week. So that really just leaves us with Robbie Anderson. Over the past few weeks, his last 3 games, he's seen 26 targets, turned into 303 yards and 2 touchdowns. He is by far the best option in this offense once again. However, he still has that riskiness with him. He's not somebody that's going to go out there and rely on huge volume. He has that big play opportunity all the time. It's a very difficult matchup going up against this Baltimore secondary. But Ryan Griffin, the tight end who sees a lot of red zone targets, he will not play here this weekend. Maybe that's more volume going the way of Robbie Anderson. I mean, that can only help here going forward. We need that volume to continue. He's a high-risk, high-reward play. If you have room to take a little bit of a gamble, I'll do it on Robbie Anderson again this week. All right, moving on to the Sunday slate. First game up, Patriots and Bengals. And man, does this offense of the New England Patriots continue to disappoint a lot of people. Do you remember when we used to rush to the waiver wire to sign or pick up any weapon that Tom Brady may have on any given week? Yeah, those days are long gone. I mean, not even close here anymore. And last week's numbers kind of tell the whole story. Julian Edelman, the only wide receiver on the roster to see more than 2 receptions. And it's going to remain that way. I mean, Julian Edelman is going to be the top target here for Tom Brady. It's the only wide receiver that he really trusts. He's seen 10-plus targets here since week 6, touchdowns in 3 out of his last 4 games. He is the only wide receiver that I will touch here in this matchup this week. But what about on the Bengals side? I mean, the Patriots team needs a win, right? Badly. And I don't know if I want to take too much risk here with the Bengals. There's no more Auden Tate. He's been put on IR. John Ross, only his 2nd game back, and he's already limited in practice. But Tyler Boyd has been killing it as of late. Over his last 3 games, 15 catches, 235 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, this is kind of where I've found something with digging a little bit deeper. A little bit of a risk here, but take a look at this tweet that I made here and I put out today. If you don't follow me on Twitter, the handle's right there on the bottom of the screen, at FNTSY Headliners. Go follow me on Twitter. I put a lot of these little tidbits of information. Kyle does also from time to time. So look at what I found here this week for Tyler Boyd if you want to take a little bit of a risk. Over the last 3 games, I just talked about it. He's had 15 receptions, 235 yards, 2 touchdowns. That's wide receiver 17 in half-point PPR scoring formats. He's also played 60% of his snaps out of the slot. So who is the slot cornerback for the New England Patriots? Well, it's one Jonathan Jones, and over his last 3 games, he's allowed 17 receptions, 291 yards, and 1 touchdown. Could this be the weak spot of the defense of the New England Patriots? It's possible. Could they move Stephon Gilmore into the slot at times? Yes. But will they shadow him the entire game? No. I highly doubt that. We need John Ross to be healthy because Tyler Boyd has some sneaky upside in this game, which we expect Cincinnati to be trailing and having to throw. Not to mention the run defense is just as good for the Patriots. If they limit Joe Mixon, that only opens up more opportunities for Tyler Boyd. If you have room to take a risk, I'll do it on Boyd here this week. Bucks and Lions up now, and man, does it suck to not have Mike Evans available for this matchup against the Detroit Lions. I'm in the Scott Fish Bowl. It's the largest fantasy football tournament in the world. 1,200 teams entered it here this year, and I just made it into the top 200 overall, the conference final, myself and Kyle also, but I just lost Mike Evans. He was the key piece to my wide receiver core. I went heavy running back, and now I'm going to be struggling looking for some wide receivers. But moving on from that, what about Chris Godwin? What does this do to him now going forward? I mean, we used to go into each week saying, is this more of an Evans game or a Godwin game? Well, we don't have to worry about the Evans games anymore. We could see a lot more Chris Godwin. And he moves in and out of the slot. Spends about 50% of his time in the slot. So it's a pretty even mixture. Will he draw Darius Slay? Yeah, sure, he will at times. But over the last 4 games, Darius Slay has allowed 23 receptions and 346 yards. He's been had here through the air as of late. You can't sit Chris Godwin, right? Absolutely not. Especially in this matchup where Detroit allows over 24 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now you see Brashad Perryman and Justin Watson there in the sit column, but they're more deep league flex options. This depends on what you really have available for your roster, your league size. I talked about these guys a little bit more in depth during the waiver wire video. I don't hate them at all this week. It really just depends on your league size for the most part. If you're in a normal 10-man league, you may not be looking towards Brashad Perryman and Justin Watson. You get anything 12 teams or larger, these guys become potential flex options, so I wanted to keep that in mind. Now for Detroit, we no longer have Marvin Jones either. He's been put on IR. He's done, so we're going to fire up Kenny Golladay, especially this week going up against Tampa Bay. Why? They allow over 37 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is the most in the NFL. We need to play wide receivers against Tampa Bay every single week. So Danny Amendola, another one of these guys similar to Perryman and Watson, the larger leagues, if you're looking for a flex play, he could see a slight bump in volume because he's seen already 16 targets over the past 2 weeks. The volume has already somewhat been there. If it ticks up any more in a great matchup, he could be a decent flex play, especially in PPR leagues though. But Kenny Golladay, the one guy that I can say for sure that I trust a little bit more just due to the touchdown upside that he brings in every single week. Texans and Titans up now, and we already know we're going to start DeAndre Hopkins for the Texans. But it's been good to see him find the end zone here as of late. 4 touchdowns over his last 3 games really helps out fantasy owners. However, after that, I don't know if I'm willing to risk it. Will Fuller, not 100% healthy. Yeah, shocker, I know. And Kenny Stills, super big play touchdown dependent. In fact, he only has one game all year scoring double-digit fantasy points in a game in which he didn't score a touchdown. It's just because the volume isn't consistently there. He's not racking in enough receptions to give you that safe floor. So in my opinion, DeAndre Hopkins, obviously the only person I would pick here in this game, despite the Titans giving up right around 21 fantasy points per game. But what about on the Titans side of things? A.J. Brown has kind of turned into a thing here as of late. Last week, 5 catches, 153 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and the guy is all about that yard after catch life. He does special things with the ball in his hands. Over his last 3 games, he has a combined 12 catches, 333 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Now, he gets a matchup going up against the Houston Texans, who allow right around 23 fantasy points per game. This is a division battle for first place. These two teams have something to play for. Do the Texans force them to throw the ball a little bit more? Is Derrick Henry limited at all with that hamstring injury that really, forces them to throw the ball more also? If that's the case, I don't hate A.J. Brown. He's obviously their best option in this offense, and it's kind of showed to trend up here the past few weeks. Now, as for Corey Davis, nah. I mean, the guy hasn't had more than 48 yards or a touchdown since week 7. I'm not willing to take that risk either here in week 15. Broncos and Chiefs up now. In the early season consistency that we saw from Courtland Sutton is almost all but gone at this point. Over his last 6 games, he's had 3 with at least 10 fantasy points and 3 under 10 fantasy points. He's very hit or miss here as of late. Drew Lock under center looks pretty good. I mean, he looks like a solid quarterback option. The problem is he's really just spreading the ball around a lot, and it's taking away some of the volume going towards Courtland Sutton. In fact, last week there was 10 separate players that saw targets from Drew Lock, and this is a very difficult secondary for the Kansas City Chiefs, who only allow 17.4 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 4th best in the NFL. Now, these two teams played back in week 7. In that game, Courtland Sutton put up 6 catches, 87 yards here against this Chiefs secondary. This is a different quarterback. There's different personnel, no more Emmanuel Sanders. Things are a little bit different now. I don't hate Courtland Sutton. He just has a little bit more risk associated with him. More of a low-end wide receiver 2 at this point. Not one of those weekly must-starts that we saw earlier in the season. A little bit of the same goes for the Kansas City Chiefs too, though, right? It's Tyreek Hill. And after that, not a whole lot of options for wide receivers. Sammy Watkins, Mecole Hardman, neither one of these guys consistent enough to throw into your starting lineup unless you're in a huge, 16-team league that you require somebody in the flex spot. Then these guys all of a sudden become an option. But for all those normal 10 or 12-man leagues, they just haven't produced consistently enough to throw them into the game. Back when these teams faced each other back in week 7, Tyreek Hill, 3 catches, 74 yards and a touchdown, despite coverage from Chris Harris. It doesn't really matter who covers Tyreek Hill. He can beat anybody, and he can beat anybody deep. You don't need a whole lot of receptions from Tyreek Hill. You need that touchdown upside, and he brings it every single week. Dolphins and Giants up now, and this game may have more question marks than any other game played on Sunday. I mean, does Devontae Parker and Albert Wilson, do they clear concussion protocol? Do they even play? If they do, I'm not worried about Allen Hurns. If they don't, all of a sudden, Allen Hurns becomes a viable starting option, especially in PPR leagues. The Dolphins throw the ball a lot, over 40 times a game, and somebody's going to have to catch the football. I would love for Fantasy Bigfoot to be available this week, though. Going up against the Giants, who allow over 26 fantasy points per game, would be a great matchup. That's 5th most in the NFL, but we really need to pay attention to the practice reports and find out who is cleared and who is actually playing here on Sunday. Now, for the Giants, who starts? Daniel Jones, Eli Manning? More than likely it's going to be Eli Manning for another week. Despite Daniel Jones, he's already back at practice, but he's with the number 2s, and they're probably going to give him one more week to get healthy before they throw him back out there, which means we get another week of Eli Manning, which was great for a half of football last week. Him and Darius Slayton looked like, a dream connection there to start that football game, but after that, basically went non-existent and didn't hear from him the entire second half of the game. Slayton led the team in targets with 5, Shepard with 4, Golden Tate a lonely 1. But what do we do in this game? Miami gives up a ton of points to wide receivers. How much? 27.9 fantasy points per game. That's 2nd most in the NFL. Which one of these guys do you choose, though? That's where it becomes difficult. If you're looking for the high upside, the risky play with the huge ceiling, then maybe you go towards Darius Slayton. If you're looking for the safer play, the safer floor, maybe then Sterling Shepard is your guy. Golden Tate didn't really seem to draw the attention of Eli Manning very much, which makes the risk even higher for him. That's why I have him in the sit column. I love Golden Tate. I just don't love it if they don't throw him the football. That's the problem. So there's a lot of question marks in this game. Make sure you watch the practice reports, the injury reports, until we can make some final decisions with all of these wide receivers. Eagles and Redskins now, and similar to the last matchup, who's available to catch passes for the Philadelphia Eagles? Anybody? Is anybody left that wants to play wide receiver for the Philadelphia Eagles? Alshon Jeffrey, done for the year. Nelson Aguilar, not 100% healthy. JJ Arcega-Whiteside, he's not getting any volume. I mean, do we really want to depend on Greg Ward at this point? You've probably never even heard of the guy. He's not going into your fantasy lineup. More than likely, in this game, they rely more on their pass-catching running backs and their tight ends and not too much their wide receivers. Now, Washington allows just over 21 fantasy points per game, but none of these guys are really on my radar. The only guy that I would maybe consider is Nelson Aguilar if he is 100% healthy and practicing fully going into the weekend. If he's limited at all, I'm not interested. Outside of that, not touching anybody else for the Philadelphia Eagles. For the Redskins, man, I really want to start Terry McLaurin. This is such a great matchup. The Eagles allow over 27 fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And at times, McLaurin and Haskins look great together. And then at other times, there's no chemistry whatsoever. There's a lot of risk involved with this pick. If you don't have room for more risk in your lineup, don't look towards Terry McLaurin. If you have a solid lineup with great matchups and you have room for that high ceiling risk, then all of a sudden, Terry McLaurin may be your guy for a flex spot. He has that upside, that touchdown ability. He is one of the best young route runners in all of the NFL. The problem is really just relying on Dwayne Haskins. That's the biggest issue because once he had Case Keenum under center, he was a top 15 fantasy wide receiver. The guy has the talent. Let's just hope Dwayne Haskins can get him the football. Seahawks and Panthers up now, and basically at this point, Tyler Lockett is doing his best impression of a bank account during Christmas. It's disappearing because he's nowhere to be found. Absolutely crazy. But you know if you bench him here in the fantasy playoffs, he's just going to go off, right? That would be like the 2019 fantasy football thing to do. It would be enough to drive us all absolutely crazy. DK Metcalf has been the safer option as of late. 6 receptions in 4 out of his last 5 games. Plus, in this game, Seattle may rely a little bit more on the running game because you can run all over. I could probably run on the Carolina Panthers at this point. I expect to see a lot of Chris Carson here this week, which means they may not have to throw the ball very much. I feel safer with DK Metcalf at this point. Tyler Lockett, more of a risky flex play because the Carolina Panthers do give up 22 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so the upside is there. It's still just a risk with Lockett until he can start to see more volume on a weekly basis. Now for Carolina, DJ Moore continues to be that solid wide receiver 2 that he's been for majority of the season. He's had 6 straight games with at least 10 fantasy points and at least 75 receiving yards in those games. He's also had 6+ receptions in 5 out of his last 6 contests, so he's not really touchdown dependent. The volume is there, the receptions are there, the yardage is there, the touchdowns, they're all bonuses. Now, as far as Curtis Samuel goes, he hasn't had more than 4 receptions in a game since week 3. Seattle's a middle-of-the-pack passing defense there. They give up, on average, around 22 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Not a bad matchup. I just don't know if I'm willing to take the risk on Curtis Samuel as much as I am on DJ Moore because he's just a lot more reliable and consistent here and has been for many, many weeks. Bears and Packers up now, and can the Chicago Bears keep this momentum going on offense that we've seen here as of late? I mean, Anthony Miller and Allen Robinson both producing, but is this the week that it comes to an end? It's going to be downright cold in Green Bay this weekend. Last I checked the forecast, temperature at game time, 14 degrees. F that. That is way too dang cold. I mean, does that limit the passing game some for the Chicago Bears? Do they rely a little bit more on their running game? I mean, Green Bay is a top 10 defense against opposing wide receivers anyway, allowing just under 20 fantasy points per game. This all of a sudden becomes a little bit more risky, but I still want to start them both just due to the production that we've seen here as of late. Over the last 3 games combined, Allen Robinson and Anthony Miller have 524 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. Huge, huge numbers. And now they've kind of opened up the offense a little bit more for Mitch Magic to scramble at times. It's keeping the defense honest. More one-on-one coverage on the outside and in the slot because they have to account for a scrambling quarterback. It's really helped things in Chicago. It's opened it up for them, and I'm willing to take a risk on both A-Rob and Anthony Miller this week, more as flex plays. They're not must-starts by any means. They're not high-end wide receiver 2s. They're flex plays with high upside here once again this week. Now for the Packers, you got Devontae Adams, right? A lot of people disappointed last week with his performance against Washington, expected a lot more, but they really didn't need him anymore because Aaron Jones was just doing whatever he wanted. Now, he's probably going to draw a lot of Kyle Fuller here this week, but that's fine. It's Devontae Adams. He's at home in Green Bay, the top option for Aaron Rodgers. The upside is going to be there for touchdowns, and you're not going to sit him at this point of your fantasy playoffs. You're hoping for a comeback game, a little bit more of a breakout game, maybe one of those big Devontae Adams games that we saw a lot last year, hoping for it here in Week 15. Vikings and Chargers up now. Is this the return of Adam Thielen? And if it is, what does that do to Stephon Diggs? This is a difficult matchup regardless. The Chargers, they're number 2 in the NFL against opposing wide receivers, giving up on average only 16.7 fantasy points per game. And Minnesota, they just don't throw the ball a whole lot. On average, only 31.6 times per game, which is second fewest in the NFL. Can we trust Adam Thielen in his first game back? Does he eat into the volume of Stephon Diggs and kind of make him irrelevant? I mean, there's a lot of risk associated with both of these guys. I would prefer to only take that risk with Stephon Diggs at this point because we know he's healthy. What if Adam Thielen goes out there in a series or two into the game, realizes, I'm not ready to go, I can't make it, and then you have to deal with that big fat zero. I'd like to see him go out there and produce, make it through a full game, and then maybe if we can advance to next week, then all of a sudden he becomes an option. So in my opinion, Stephon Diggs, more of a flex play in a difficult matchup this week. Not that high-end wide receiver 2 number, but more of a solid flex here in a difficult matchup. Now for the Chargers, I like both Keenan Allen and Mike Williams here this week. Both of these guys, the back-to-back games with at least 10 fantasy points. Mike Tagliere on Twitter had a stat come out here this past day, and it said that Mike Williams has had at least one reception of 43 yards or more in 6 straight games. That is a crazy stat if you think about it. The guy loves to go deep, and Phillip Rivers is looking for him on a consistent basis. Minnesota allows 24.9 fantasy points per game, 9th most in the NFL. Xavier Rhodes went down last week. Sounds like he may be back, but it doesn't really matter. The guy hasn't been shut down like he has been in the past regardless. A good matchup here. They're going to have to throw the ball in LA. I'll start both these guys. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams both have touchdown upside in my opinion, and they would both be in a lineup if I needed a wide receiver here in Week 15. Jags and Raiders up now, and it was good to see the volume return for DJ Chark last week in Week 14. What was not good to see was him in a walking boot afterwards. Now, it's still unclear whether he plays or not this week. If I had to guess, I think they sit him. Why throw him back out there in a meaningless game in a lost season? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but as of right now, has not yet been ruled out. If he is, who's next up? It's Dede Westbrook and Chris Conley. In my opinion, Dede Westbrook a little bit safer. He's seen at least 6 targets over his past 4 games. The usage of Chris Conley kind of been all over the place. There was a stretch there in the middle of the season where his target share started to creep back up with Nick Foles. Then Gardner Minshew comes back over the last couple weeks, and Chris Conley's kind of been non-existent at times. In my opinion, Dede Westbrook is the only other option that I would use here in a game in which we want to use a wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Raiders give up over 25 fantasy points per game, so Dede Westbrook would be my next up in line if DJ Chark does sit. But what about the Oakland Raiders? There's no options here, really. I mean, Tyrell Williams could be on the list. I mean, I put one Raider on the list at least. I put him in the sit column, but at least he's on the list. I just don't trust him at all. He's only had one game with at least 10 fantasy points over his last 6 games. Not somebody that you're willing to trust right now in the fantasy playoffs, regardless of the matchup of who he's facing. Browns and Cardinals up now, and is there anybody out there with me in YouTube land that wants to give Odell Beckham the fantasy finger at this point? I get it, he's not 100% healthy, and depending on your choices on your roster, I would not blame you if you benched him here this week. Jarvis Landry has been the better option for a long time now, right? He's had 10 plus fantasy points in 6 straight games, 5 touchdowns during that span. He's also seen at least 10 targets in 5 out of his last 7 games played. As of right now, he's number 8 in the NFL in red zone receptions, number 5 in yards after the catch, number 8 in targets, and number 11 overall in receiving yards. He's going up against the Arizona Cardinals, which allow the 6th most points to fantasy wide receivers at 25.4 fantasy points per game. Odell Beckham at this point, nothing more than a flex play at best in my opinion. Jarvis Landry, more of a wide receiver too. Now, like I said, it really depends on what options you have. If you make the decision to bench Odell Beckham, be prepared to deal with the consequences if it's one of his games where he does go off and finds the end zone. That is always entirely possible. It's not like this guy is a crappy receiver. It's been a rough year, but that upside is always there. So just make sure you know that going in, that there's always that risk. Now for Arizona, you got Christian Kirk. He really remains to be the guy here in Arizona. He's averaging 9 targets, 6 receptions, and 62 yards over his last 6 games. Fitzgerald hasn't had more than 70 yards receiving since week 2. In my opinion, Christian Kirk is the guy here who could find some openings against this defense of the Cleveland Browns, and the volume will continue to be there. Christian Kirk, I will start. Larry Fitzgerald, staying in the sit column. Rams and Cowboys up now, and Robert Woods continues to stockpile balls. Yeah, that's right. I said that on the internet. Over his last 4 games, he's had 47 targets, 33 receptions, 462 yards, and a touchdown. Since week 10, he's wide receiver 10 overall in half-point PPR formats. And oh yeah, don't forget, he didn't even play week 11. He's putting up huge numbers. Now, Cooper Kupp, he found the end zone for his 2nd straight game last week, but he's only seen single-digit targets 4 out of his last 5 games and hasn't had more than 65 yards receiving in a game in that span. All of the volume is going towards Robert Woods and Todd Gurley, and the Rams are winning football games because of it. Now, Dallas, they allow right around 19 fantasy points per game, but Robert Woods remains in that wide receiver 2 category, where Cooper Kupp still kind of trending down. He's kind of a flex play at best at this point. Hasn't seen that double-digit volume, that consistency on a week-to-week basis for me to trust him any more than that going forward. Now for Dallas, you have Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup, Randall Cobb. In my opinion, Amari Cooper is a big risk this week. He's going to spend most of his time matched up with Jalen Ramsey of the Los Angeles Rams. That really limits his ceiling. He's more of a low-end wide receiver 2 at best for me this week, but it's a game that Dallas has to have. I like Michael Gallup a lot more this week. Randall Cobb, not so much on my radar either. He's going to draw coverage from Nikel Roby-Coleman, and he's only allowed more than 60 yards 3 times all year long. Michael Gallup draws the best coverage out of anybody here, and the volume is going to be there for him. They're going to need to continue to throw the ball in Dallas to keep pace with the Rams. The offense has looked a lot better as of late. I expect a heavy dose of Ezekiel Elliott early in this game to try to establish the running game. If that happens, Michael Gallup could feast on the outside. Amari Cooper always has that potential upside, that touchdown upside. A very difficult defensive matchup for him, though. He's a very high-risk, high-reward play here in Week 15. Falcons and Niners up now, and yet another wide receiver down this year. Calvin Ridley placed on IR, done for the year. But at least Julio Jones and the Falcons get the San Francisco 49ers after they've suffered some injuries, I guess you could say. Richard Sherman, Quan Williams, both injuries there in the secondary of the San Francisco 49ers. That plays a part in this game. It kind of makes this matchup a little bit more tolerable. Julio Jones has a little bit more opportunity, and now Russell Gage will fill the role of Calvin Ridley. We just saw Drew Brees shred this defense with these players last week. Is there a possibility that Matt Ryan can get things going this week? Absolutely possible. Julio Jones, more of a low-end wide receiver 1 this week. Russell Gage, more of a flex play at best in deeper leagues. Not somebody who's an absolute must-start by any single means. But, he's definitely another option to take a look at if you're needing a wide receiver. Now, for the San Francisco side of things, you have Deebo Samuel and Emmanuel Sanders. Sanders, basically my call of the week last week, had him as a start. The guy went out there and looked great. He looks healthy finally, put up huge numbers. Deebo Samuel, he continued to score double-digit fantasy points now in 5 straight games, and the Atlanta defense allows right around 24 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This is one of the most creative offenses in all of football under Kyle Shanahan. Throwing the ball, running the ball, receiving the ball, all are on the table for these wide receivers, and the best part of it, more than likely, they're your flex play this week because they weren't somebody that you drafted highly and have to rely on a weekly basis. As a flex play, both these guys have huge ceilings once again here in Week 15. Bills and Steelers up now in another tough matchup for the wide receivers of the Buffalo Bills. The Pittsburgh secondary is playing very well, more of a bend but don't break style of football. John Brown, his numbers have been declining here as of late. Over his last 3 games combined, 8 receptions, 91 yards, 2 touchdowns. And the problem is he can't connect on the deep ball with Josh Allen. There's times where he has his defender beat and the ball is just overthrown. In fact, he's seen 23 deep targets on the season. That's 4th in the NFL. He just has more risk associated with himself right now than the likes of a Cole Beasley maybe. Beasley has 3 straight games with at least 10 fantasy points, 6 touchdowns over his last 8 games. Cole Beasley, the Beasles is a red zone threat all of a sudden. Now, Pittsburgh, they've shown they've been vulnerable at times to slot wide receivers, and Beasley's getting a little bit more quality looks at this point. It makes him the safer option. John Brown, more of a wide receiver 3 low-end flex play with upside. Cole Beasley, I'll have him as a low-end wide receiver 2 this week, just for the safety in this offense here going forward. Now, for Pittsburgh, does Juju return this week? He's back at practice fully. But who takes Tre'Davious White? Is it Deontay Johnson? Is it James Washington? Because we know Juju, if he plays, will spend the majority of his time in the slot, but it doesn't really matter. This defense is legit for the Buffalo Bills. Right now, number 3 against opposing wide receivers, giving up only 16.8 fantasy points per game. How good are they? That's only 2.6 fantasy points per game more than the New England Patriots, who are the number 1 defense there against opposing wide receivers. Solid offense. A lot of question marks of who gets volume. Where does Tre'Davious White travel? There's too many question marks and too much risk, in my opinion, to put it on any one of these guys for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Hopefully you have better options. More than likely, you probably do. Let somebody else take these risks, because I'm not willing to do it here in the fantasy playoffs. Colts and Saints up now, and is there another pass-catching weapon in Indianapolis? Or was it just because they played the horrible defense of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last week? I mean, it doesn't sound like T.Y. Hilton is going to play this week. Heck, he may be out remainder of the season. So it's up to Marcus Johnson and Zach Pascal. Now, New Orleans, they allow 27.2 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Where does Marshawn Lattimore go? More than likely, he shadows Zach Pascal, but Marshawn Lattimore has been anything but shut down here over the past couple weeks. Look at that defense last week and how they were carved up by Jimmy G. Deebo Samuel, Emmanuel Sanders, both had great games, both played really well. And New Orleans has a great run defense. If they limit Marlon Mack in the backfield, they may be forced to throw the ball all game long. The volume could be there. The risk could be there. Both of these guys, more deep league flex options in my opinion, just based off of the matchup alone. We know that New Orleans can go out there and score points at home. If that's the case, maybe Zach Pascal and Marcus Johnson get more opportunities. Just know going into the game, there is risk associated with both of these plays. For the Saints, you have Michael Thomas. I don't care who he's playing. You start Michael Thomas every single week. All right, those are all my starts and sits here. Week 15 fantasy football. Let me know what you think down below in the comment section. Once again, don't get too caught up with what column these guys were in. Take that information and apply it to your league, to your team. It may help you make your decisions a little bit easier on Sundays. That's what it's all about. Just a reminder, just because the season is almost over does not mean that this channel stops. We go year-round over here with all types of football content and have a few tricks up our sleeves here for 2020. So make sure you stay subscribed. We greatly appreciate the support. It's been a great season. Looking for some fantasy championships, make sure you put down below in the comment section if you win your fantasy championship, if you're going to your championship game. We would love to wish you good luck. More championships we have here for Headliner Nation, the better. Heck, tag me on Twitter. I'll retweet it out to people. Let them know that you're out there dominating your leagues. Greatly appreciate the support once again. Hopefully you guys have a great rest of your week. We'll talk to you later.